Alrighty, friends. Well, it's about that time, 7:30 on the third Monday night of the month. Welcome to the Bird Study Group monthly webinar. My name is Jackson Hudecki, if we haven't met, and I am the Bird Study Group Director for the Hamilton Naturalist Club, and I'm once again very happy that you're here and happy to be bringing some awesome birdie content to you at home during this wacky time. I'm in ultra comfy mode tonight. I hope you are too. We've got a really special guest that will be joining us shortly, but as always, I'll start with some information and some stuff in case it's your first time here, but if it's your 100th time here, it's always good to hear it anyways. So we always like to start off by recognizing that the 40-kilometer radius of the Hamilton study area falls on the treaty lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat nations, particularly the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. These lands that we look at and study and survey and hike and enjoy and explore have roots far beyond ours as settlers of this land. And so, of course, we like to pay respects to our indigenous communities who were here long before we were. If this is your first time here, we typically meet right from 7:30 and we go until around 9 o'clock. We are virtual. We've been doing this in September, but we have even added a special month where typically in May, where most people are out during bird migration, we will be having a May session even, but likely in September. I assume we were going to be here in September, October, November, and December. So if you're used to Zoom by now, then you'll be right at home. So typically our presentations last, when we do get to it, for about 45 minutes with some question and answer to follow. Our chat function is open here tonight, so myself and our president, Chris Motherwell, will be surveying the chat page and the Q&A page. So at any time you have something to say, you can put it in the chat, but if you have a question for our speaker or for Chris or myself, you can throw it in the Q&A section at any time. The Bird Study Group has been a part of the Hamilton Naturalist Club, which is in our 101st year for decades. And the goal has always been to try and find a way to kind of continue, again, this birding community's connection to one another outside of the hiking trails. And now typically we would be meeting in person somewhere at the Burlington Senior Center, but we are meeting here and we're putting our minds, continuing our bird education together. We want to keep the conversations going, whether it is about bird ecology threats, efforts, and predictions, or new data, which is what our theme is going to be tonight. But we like to amplify the voices of people making a difference, and that could be you. We are building our rosters of people who are working in the bird community. So if you or someone you know is out there actively making a difference, let us know. We want to talk about that. We want to celebrate that. We want to know who is out there helping nature and our feathered friends. But we want to bring any birder, any nature lover, if you're a beginner or an expert, here to us, because there's always room to learn. Now, migration is on. There's no doubt about it. Migration is occurring. We're seeing it. We're hearing it. Tundra swans on the move. I don't think we've had a year in the last couple like we've had, was it 2018, I think, where we had that banner year of just thousands of tundra swans flying over. So we've had pockets. We've had, 120 here, 80 there, a couple hundred each day at least. So that's been great. A lone black vulture has been spotted, a greater white-fronted goose up in the Cambridge area, white-winged crossbills, even some common and a hoary redpoll have been kicking around, which I think some birders have been saying, well, with the warmer weather, they're probably going to skedaddle. but it's been interesting to see that they've remained. So thanks to Barry Coombs, we've got this cool photo of a white-winged crossbill found around the Sagado Fields in the Pine Needham Bulls Point Trail of Royal Botanical Gardens. 7 king eiders were spotted around the Lake Ontario area in one day, which was pretty great. And then the typical spring migrants, the early migrants, the turkey vultures, killdeer, red-winged blackbirds en masse. People have been seeing golden-crowned kinglets and hearing and spotting American woodcock or timber doodles, common grackles. So migration is starting. So if you're with us right now and you want to share in the chat function something in migration that you've noticed already and maybe it isn't on this list or something that you're finding exciting, let us know. Robins, American robins, are making their return back into neighborhoods. I've been hearing them here in downtown Hamilton quite a bit and seeing the regular posting of the average non-birder, but spring is here, the robins are back. So I've been enjoying seeing people comment on cardinals and robins making their vocal appearance in our neighborhood. So it's starting. Migration started. I even saw that someone from the Peterborough Field Naturalists had stated that they saw a pine warbler at a feeder last week. So it won't be long before we're hearing or seeing them in the HSA as well. So in some community updates, we've had some good movement with, and I say we, I basically mean George Naylor has been tackling this major awareness campaign to ensure that bank swallows, that a bridge that is slated for construction will ensure that the bank swallow colony that has been calling that bridge home for ages will ensure that they are protecting that colony there. And in order to kind of keep the efforts going, there's a petition floating around with, George told me today, 17,000 signatures so far, which is great. And if we're seeing proof that this awareness works, if you've been watching what's been happening with that beautiful wetland where Amazon was slated to pave over to put a big factory, they're not doing that now. And so, and I forget off the top of my head, I should have wrote it down earlier, but it's been in the news like crazy. So all that to say is between this and between these news stories is that when we get together, when the community recognizes that something shouldn't be happening, and a concerted effort is made, that we can make some good positive changes. These are just 2 little glimpses into what we can do, perhaps on a greater scale. Maybe a conversation for another time. Our May talk, I'm hoping to have a few speakers, not just one. I want to have 3 speakers give 20-minute presentations to us. And George is going to talk to us not only about the bank swallows, but he's been working also talking with Bell and a few other companies about osprey nests. When the ospreys are putting their nests up on those big cell towers, a lot of these companies are just removing the nests. And so George has been working to ensure that these companies are aware that this is happening and perhaps to protect that. And he's going to tell us all about that in May. But a couple months before that happens, I'd be interested to see how this plays out between now and then. The Beamer Hawk Watch, of course, has begun as of March 1st. So another sign of migration is the big raptor movement. So these were the numbers as of yesterday, which is looking pretty cool that we've seen some good movements already. Turkey vultures in large numbers, 473 have been spotted so far, again, as of yesterday. So bald eagles aplenty, 26 have passed by the Grimsby Beamer Conservation Area. But it's been also cool to see the red shoulder hawks. We have 68 have moved through there, and the red tails, 217. So looking pretty good for an early start there. Some rough-legged, some goldens, some kestrels, some merlins, some unknown ones. But yeah, off to a good start for the first couple weeks of March. It'll be interesting to watch those numbers climb as the days go on. So keep your eyes to the skies for those Swainsons or anything else that might be unusual. I wonder when the first osprey is going to show up. On behalf of Jen Baker, the Hamilton Naturalist Club, and Environment Hamilton. The Biodiversity Action Plan has been something that's been in the works for quite some time, where the HNC and EH have been working together with the city to put together this framework that is being presented to City Council on April 7th. So this is a statement that I lifted from the HamiltonPollinatorParadise.org website, which you can see the link there. So the Hamilton Pollinator Paradise Project is a collaborative initiative between Environment Hamilton and the Hamilton Naturalist Club with support from various funders. We are working with the community to build a pollinator corridor across the city by planting habitat including native plants, milkweed, and other wildflowers. Our work promotes and enhances Hamilton's unique biodiversity. The project also shares information and resources about why pollinators are in trouble and what other actions people can take. By creating connected habitats across the city, we will also be increasing our resiliency of our neighborhoods. So really working with the city to ensure that efforts are being put across on many levels. Hamilton is a bee-friendly city, which is pretty great. But this is just another step forward to ensure that this is decisions that are made are kind of put through this lens, and it shows that the city is taking action and taking things seriously when presented by forces like Environment Hamilton and the Naturalist Club, and like you and I. So keep your eyes and ears open to our social media pages, because and consider even and through some of those channels, there might be some actions to take, which could be something like writing your counselor, should it ever come down to any sort of vote, so that you're telling your counselor, depending where you are, if you're from Hamilton, of course, that you support these initiatives and you support your counselor supporting it. So keep that in mind, but it's a really great step, and it's been in the works for a long time. So keep your fingers crossed, keep your eyes and ears open to the Biodiversity Action Plan, because that is a good positive step for Mother Nature and this earth. With that being said, we're looking for some support. The Sheila Dunduli Nature Sanctuary, which is the Naturalist Club's newest plot of land, which, if you are unaware, last year, or in the last couple of years, I should say, the biggest donation in club history, $250,000, was donated to the Hamilton Naturalist Club to purchase a chunk of land, which is just off of Highway 6 and the QEW highway, or 403 highway, kind of by that driving range there. Just behind it, sandwiched between the driving range and the Gates of Heaven Cemetery, is this large swath of land that was for sale, or it was owned by a woman who, through the help of Sheila Dunduli, through this generous donation, we were able to purchase this land in order to preserve it henceforth. And it, of course, comes with a few issues like invasive species. So we have been working with a company that is going to help bring goats to the land, so that the goats can just start eating and eating and eating and eating to try and help get rid of these invasive species. Now, so it says here how to help. A generous donor is matching all the donations up to $10,000. The HNC has currently raised $7,500, so we need help in getting our last $2,500 to reach our funding goal. So to make a donation or to learn more about the project, you can visit hamiltonnature.org or our website, or contact Jen Baker at land@hamiltonnature.org for more information. So that's a great donation. It's huge, but anything we can do in order to preserve these spaces is incredible. I'm not sure if you're watching how land is being sold around here, but properties around the Hamilton area, especially in the rural areas, are going for millions of dollars right now. And there is, of course, other action to be taken with urban sprawl, and we're really trying to push our counselors to ensure that very critical farmland is not just being paved over for future development. Soil health is incredibly important, and that land is wonderful to be farmed on, not so much to be developed on. So other things to look for as well if you're following the Environment Hamilton page. I just took a look at the chat there and my mind immediately sidetracked because I probably said bank swallow, and Glenn, thank you. I did mean cliff swallow. So yes, there is a petition out there. Thank you, Leanne, for putting that in there, because I'm just talking a lot and not really thinking about what I'm saying. So thank you for that. If you are new to tonight or to anything, there's ways of following the action. I should have put Environment Hamilton's pages in here. So of course you can follow the HNC on Facebook and on Instagram, and I think on Twitter. Hamilton Naturalist Club and Ontario Birds have a Discord page. And Rob Porter, who I'll talk about in a second, is continuing his work with the Songbirding Project, which is awesome. We, of course, are looking for members. Anytime you would like to become a member of the Naturalist Club, jump on board. You get a copy of the wood duck, which comes to you by mail, which is awesome, because if COVID has taught anything, it's that mail is still pretty great to get if it's not a bill. And of course, there have been some changes to the wood duck in the last couple of years, but I really am liking the duckling section of it. So you haven't seen it yet. You know, to support the young junior naturalists out there. I know my kids, you know, when they get the wood duck, they flip through and they look at all the cool pictures, but to have a section just for them is pretty great. But we're trying to find ways of including you some more as well. So if you would like to be a contributor to the wood duck, there are ways of doing that. But becoming a member is a great first step, and then you can see all the greatness that comes from that. If you ever have any questions, you can reach out to me, birdstudygroup@hamiltonnature.org, or visit our website, or send us messages in this chat anytime. Our April meeting, there's two parts to this right now, is to share with you what it's going to be about. So our very own Rob Porter is going to be delivering a talk on bird listening, how to improve your birding by ear. So if you, in the last couple of years, have been hearing the word bioacoustics project, Rob and a few others have been purchasing through the club these amazing devices that we are plunking, they are plunking down in certain nature sanctuaries, which are automatically recording any noises that are occurring in that section. And we're able to track different and various species as a result of this software, which is quite incredible. And the best way to be learning about this is to know your bird song by ear, which is not the easiest thing. So this next month's talk is going to be a great way to start wrapping your head and your ears around bird song and bird calls. So the statement here, learning bird songs and calls, is often cited as one of the biggest challenges in birding, but it doesn't have to be that way. It may be hard to believe at first, but anyone without significant hearing loss can build up this seemingly arcane skill. We'll go over some popular myths about the difficulty of birding by ear and various strategies you can use to slowly and reliably improve your birding by ear abilities. Now, the second part of this is Rob has requested a few volunteers, or a small panel. And what he's hoping for is to have some interaction between himself, me, and a couple other folks who would be willing to kind of be test subjects in this. So you'd be on screen, your mics would be on, and Rob would be talking about and walking us through a few different exercises. So if you would be interested in this, you can reach out to Rob or myself. director@large@hamiltonnature.org is Rob's email address. But again, you can reach out to me and say, I'd like to participate in this. Again, we only take a couple. So, you know, send it to us en masse if you want, if you'd be interested and willing. That would be awesome. And then you can help be part of next month's talk. I'll pause for a sec just to read the chat, because Glenn Barrett has added something for us to also be aware of. The Save Our Peer Facebook group lobbying to keep the Burlington Ship Canal piers open to the public. So Transport Canada is planning to fence them off, blocking public access. So contact your local MPs and or sign the petition. So an amazing spot to be connecting with the area's biodiversity and birds. I mean, like, a great spot to watch the long-tailed ducks, to look for harlequin ducks, purple sandpipers shown up there. That's where, that same spot is where the king eiders have been seen. And so to be stopped from going to that area, totally not great. So thank you, Glenn, for bringing awareness to that. Again, the power of our collective abilities, if we're able to rally together, we could ensure that certain things either happen or don't happen. So let's work together. Okay. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our special guest speaker. So I was tipped off to this subject, particularly because I was born without a sense of smell. If you know what the technical term for it is, throw it in the chat and you'll get 1,000 bonus points from me. But my dad was born without a sense of smell, and his parents didn't even believe him. But my dad had 5 kids, and at number 4, I was born without a sense of smell as well. And when I was told only the turkey vulture has a great sense of smell, other birds don't really have a great sense of smell, I was like, hey, cool. Like, maybe that's one reason why I love them so much. But then this article was passed to me that, wait a minute, birds can smell? And it's, of course, we're learning new things all the time. That's why you're here tonight. That's why we do this. That's why the bird study group exists, to keep our knowledge expanding. So Leanne is here to talk to us about what she's been working on. So originally from Manitoba, living in Southern Ontario since 2012, studying under the one and only Jim Quinn, and with Beth McDougall Shackleton at Western U, primarily studying animal behavior and communication, work on acoustic communication in a joint nesting cooperative breeding cuckoo and smooth-billed Annie, work on chemical communication in song sparrows, started birding in 2006, but much more involved in birding as a hobby since 2012. Lucky to work with birds professionally as a biologist and a research scientist, and likes to spend her free time enjoying birds for fun via hiking and birding. Happy to have an ornithologist here, Leanne Grieves. So let's sit back, open our eyes, open our ears, open our noses to the study of bird smell with the one and only Leanne Grieves. Let's put our hands together. Leanne, it's all yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be here today. So thank you very much for having me. Just going to make sure this goes into full screen. Does that show full screen properly? I hope so. And I'm just going to move my video so that I can see my screen. Great, yeah, so thanks again. As Jackson mentioned, I'll be sharing some of my recent research on how birds, especially song sparrows, use smell in their social communication, and especially how they use smell with respect to their courtship and breeding communication and behavior. So with that, I'm going to jump in right away. I think there should be definitely time for questions after. And so I will be happy to answer any questions at the end of my talk. So when we think about animal communication, especially avian communication, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind is their visual communication. Much like us, birds are most birds anyways, are quite visually oriented. So we're all really familiar with enjoying birds' striking, beautiful plumage that they'll use to attract mates and advertise their quality. We know that other animal groups like mammals, insects, spiders, they do this as well. Another huge focus of bird research that we're going to hear about next month is to think about their acoustic communication. So again, we love the beautiful or irritating songs and calls of birds. And again, other animal groups, including mammals, insects, and other species, use acoustic communication as well. So of course, advertising for mates, advertising their territory boundaries, or telling territory intruders to leave. But there's other modes of communication that we don't think about or study as often. So one of these would be seismic or vibratory communication, including things like infrasound, which is really low frequency sound that humans can't hear, but birds actually can hear. We don't know of any birds that produce infrasound, but in terms of vibrations, we do know some species of birds can vibrate their wing feathers really quickly. So earlier we were talking about some of the first woodcocks that have returned, pheasants, grouse, turkeys, a lot of their courtship displays and territorial sounds come from vibrational communication through feather movement. But something that we even more rarely think about birds with respect to is chemical communication. So Jackson mentioned the turkey vulture earlier, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But when we think about animals that communicate using smell, we might think about our pets, cats and dogs that might mark their territory, other mammals, a lot of insects that might advertise some kind of odor signature of the group or the colony that they belong to, or maybe they might advertise that they're toxic. But we very rarely think about how birds might be using smell. And of course, that's going to be the focus of what I will share with you today. So one of the reasons we so rarely think about smell in birds is because there's been this long-standing myth that birds don't smell, or that they have a very poor sense of smell. And a lot of the reason why this myth has persisted for the past even 200 years, I think, is actually John James Audubon's fault. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of the background on why Audubon may be to blame for this myth being prevalent into the present day. So in the early 1800s, around the 1820s, Audubon designed a couple of experiments to test whether or not birds can use smell to find food. And he focused on, in the paper, he said that he studied the turkey vulture, or turkey buzzard as it was called at the time, but it was subsequently realized that we're pretty sure he was actually studying the black vulture. Nevertheless, vultures are, as I'm sure everyone knows, carrion eaters. So we tend to think they would probably have a really good sense of smell because they need to find these carcasses around their environment. But Audubon wanted to test whether this was indeed the case. So in 1820 or so, he dragged a deer carcass out into the environment, and then he completely covered it with leaves so that there would be no visual cue of the carcass. And then the idea would then be that the vultures would have to locate the carcass using smell. And so this carcass was placed out for several days, and Audubon monitored the site to see if any vultures would come and investigate, and no vultures showed up. So Audubon took this as evidence that the birds were not using their sense of smell to find carrion. There was a problem with this experiment, though, and it was that Audubon used a putrid, rotting carcass. And you may or may not know this, but even though vultures have these amazingly strong stomachs with really, really intense acid that can digest safely dead meat, they actually don't like to eat rotten food. They much prefer fresh carrion that's only a day or two old. And this is because even though their stomachs are really well equipped for eating this kind of food, they can still get sick and die from eating putrid corpses. So they really don't prefer rotten food, and likely they just avoided this really old rank carcass. But in good scientific fashion, Audubon did design a follow-up study to further test whether or not vultures were using smell or vision primarily to find their food. So in this second experiment, he, I don't know where he got it, but he dragged out a life-size oil painting of a deer carcass into the environment. And in this case, he reasoned that the only cue available should be the visual cue of the painted deer. So again, he watched to see if vultures would come and inspect the painting, and sure enough, vultures did come and check out the painting. So from this, Audubon concluded that vultures are not actually using their sense of smell, but they're using vision to find food. The problem with this experiment was that, unbeknownst to Audubon, the oil paints actually give off a chemical called methylmercaptan. And this is actually the same chemical that's given off by freshly dead corpses. And so, in fact, the vultures were probably cueing into that methylmercaptan that was volatilizing off the painting, rather than looking at the image of the deer and thinking that it was a good meal. So it may be that this is one of the main reasons why many people to this day think that birds can't smell. But we know now that that's not true at all. In fact, all birds that have been studied to date have a fully functional olfactory system. So as far as we know, every bird species can smell, and a lot of bird species have at least as keen a sense of smell as things like rabbits and rats that we think of as having a very keen sense of smell. So birds can smell, and they can smell well. Here I've given a few examples of the kinds of birds that we might more typically associate with using their sense of smell. So we've got seabirds like petrels that might spend hours, if not days, out over the open ocean foraging by locating food largely using smell. Another seabird here on the top right is the crested auklet. And these guys are really interesting because in the breeding season, they actually produce scented feathers at the base of their neck, and they smell a bit like tangerine. I've never had the privilege of smelling or seeing a crested auklet, but the researchers that have studied them have characterized this tangerine-like odor, and they think it has to do with courtship and mating. As I've mentioned, the turkey vulture in the bottom right and other carrion eaters, probably other raptors as well, can use smell to find food. And I mean, if you look at their nostrils here, they're just huge. And I also wanted to highlight the brown kiwi. As you might notice from the other three species of birds, their nostrils are located at the base of the bill, which is typical for most bird species. But the brown kiwi, I have in the inset here, the nostrils, I'm not sure if my pointer is visible, but the brown kiwi's nostrils are actually located right down at the tip of the bill. And this is because brown kiwis are nocturnal foragers. They have really small eyes, as I hope you can see in the picture. So they actually don't use their vision that much for foraging because it's dark and they can't see, but they'll actually probe through the leaf litter and feel and also smell for invertebrates and other good things to eat under the soil. But of course, I wanted to focus not on any of these big charismatic birds with big nostrils that we think of as smelling really, really keenly. I wanted to focus on tiny little sparrows that we think maybe don't have a very good sense of smell just because they're so small, or we've not really studied them very much before with respect to their smell. And what I look at is not so much how birds are using smell to find food or avoid predators, but I'm really interested in the kinds of things birds are smelling about each other. And to do this, I look at preen oil, because we know that preen oil can produce odor or have odorous compounds in it. So for anyone who's not familiar, I feel like most people here likely will know about how birds preen, and they have this preen gland, also called the uropygial gland, but it's located at the base of the tail. And this crossbill here is just probing the gland with its bill, and when it does that, it causes some oil to be secreted. So I'll just show a little bit of a blow up of what this gland looks like. This blow up, just by the way, is from a Swainson's thrush. It's not a crossbill. But so there's a little nipple-like papilla of the gland, and when the bird probes the gland with its bill, like that crossbill is doing, a little bit of preen oil will be excreted, and then the bird can groom that through its feathers. And we know that that has waterproofing and maintenance functions for the feathers. But as I mentioned, we're increasingly learning that this preen oil also can produce odors, and they might differ between different groups of birds in interesting ways. And birds might then use those odors to get information about each other that they could then make decisions about each other based on. So my main research question in my PhD, which I just finished a little under a year ago, is whether or not preen oil odor is important to birds. And to look at this research, I worked with the Song Sparrow. As I'm sure everyone knows, they are really abundant, which is one reason why I wanted to work with them, because there are so many of them. They're pretty easy to catch. They're found throughout most of North America. They're relatively prolific. There are so many different subspecies with different plumage, morphology, and song dialects, but I focused on our local subspecies, Melospiza melodia. And I studied them at 3 locations in Ontario. I worked with song sparrows in London, Ontario, on Western University property. I also went to the Rare Charitable Research Reserve in Cambridge, which is a beautiful hiking spot for anyone who's never been. It can be quite busy with birds in the spring in particular. And then I also worked at the Queen's University Biological Station on Lake Opinicon, which is about an hour north of Kingston. So I had 3 different populations of song sparrows that I worked with for this research. So a lot of what I did involved going out in the field and trapping song sparrows. I used these seed-baited potter traps in the top left. So for anyone who's not familiar with these, it's similar to any other kind of live animal trap, where there's a little treadle that you can set the door open, and there's sort of a panel on the bottom that lifts up when the treadle is set to hold the door open. We put millet in the bottom of these traps, and then as the bird walks in, it lowers the panel, which trips the treadle, the door slides shut, and the birds get stuck. And then I also used mist netting, which people might be more familiar with for catching birds. So in the middle panel, you might very faintly see the mist net panels, and the pink arrow shows a song sparrow that I'm extracting. And so once I catch my song sparrows, we do put bands on them so that we can identify them again later. I collect other kinds of samples as well for various other research projects. I do collect blood so that I can do some genetic analyses. Because song sparrows look the same, males and females, I can use molecular genetics techniques to sex the birds. And then, of course, I collect preen oil. And so this is a pretty straightforward process. Here, again, is showing the preen gland of a song sparrow. And I have these thin little tubes, they're called capillary tubes, and I just probe the gland similar to how the bird would use its bill to do. And that causes just a little bit of oil to be excreted, which then I suck up in the tube. And just that tiny amount of preen oil is enough for me to do my analyses on. So I went out in the field and I collected preen oil from hundreds of birds. And then I did bring a group of about 40 birds into captivity for some behavioral experiments as well. So what do I do with preen oil? it's actually quite a complex substance, and I won't really get into the chemistry, but I wanted to give you an idea of how I actually can process that preen oil in the lab to get some actual data out of it. So I use this technique called gas chromatography. An example of how the machine looks is on the top, and then on the bottom is just a schematic of how the machine works. But basically, I dissolve the preen oil in an organic solvent, and then I put it into this machine at a high temperature, and that will then vaporize the preen oil. So all the different compounds in the preen oil will vaporize, and they will spread out and separate through the machine, traveling through a column that's heated. And the speed at which they travel is related to the molecular mass of each compound in the preen oil. And so all of these things traveling in vapor form will move through the column over time. And as they come out of the column, they hit a detector, which gives me a signal. And at the end of this process, I end up with something called a chromatogram, which I have here on the right. And essentially, each of these peaks is a compound or a set of compounds that have the same mass that come out. Again, things that take longer to come out are larger compounds. Things that come out a little more quickly are smaller. And I can look at the peak size to get a measure of how abundant each of these compounds are. So this peak 33 is pretty high, meaning there's more of whatever that is compared to what's this small peak like C29 or C30. So I can take all of this information about these peaks and their abundance to run some statistical analyses to compare the chromatograms between all kinds of different birds and see if they're different or not. As I mentioned, I brought some birds in captivity too, and then I basically just put them in this little maze where I asked them, you know, are they interested in this preen oil and what do they prefer? So in this case, I would put the birds in the maze. There's a little start chamber here at the front with sliding doors. And then I can open the door, let the bird into the maze, and I can measure how much time it spends in the left side of the maze and in the right side of the maze. And in each side of the maze, when the experiment's running, I will have placed preen oil from 2 different kinds of birds. And I'll give a little more detail about how this experiment works shortly. So again, I mentioned that I can get these chromatograms from basically superheating the preen oil. And I end up with a chromatogram like this for every single bird that I wanted to measure. As I mentioned, all these different peaks represent different compounds, and the different height of the peak might differ between individuals. And I can then take all that information to create 1 point for every individual bird that represents this entire chromatogram. And then I can plot that on a 2-dimensional space such that points that are closer together indicate birds whose chromatograms are more similar, so their preen oil is more similar chemically. And then points that are farther apart mean the birds are more chemically different in their preen oil. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. It's kind of a process to go from this complicated chromatogram to a single dot on a graph, but that's sort of how that works in a nutshell. So one of the first things I wanted to look at is species differences in preen oil. And so I looked at brown-headed cowbirds and song sparrows, and specifically I looked at female cowbirds because we know that they are brood parasites and they really like to parasitize song sparrows. So if you imagine that every dot is one of those chromatograms, you can see very clearly here that the yellow, representing the song sparrow preen oil, is really significantly different chemically than the purple female brown-headed cowbird preen oil. So I found right away that there are these clear species differences in preen oil composition. Because brown-headed cowbirds are a major brood parasite of song sparrows, they really like to parasitize song sparrow nests. I reasoned that song sparrows might do well to pay attention to brown-headed cowbird odor, and they might want to avoid that odor. And so that's where this choice experiment comes in. But first, I just wanted to give a little plug for the cowbird. I know that a lot of people dislike cowbirds. I know that they cause some ecological harm because they have spread with the advance of agriculture, and cowbirds are doing great, and some species at risk that they parasitize are not doing great. But I do just want to give a little reminder that cowbirds are a native species, and they have this beautifully adapted strategy to offload their parenting. So female cowbirds, as I'm sure you all know, lay their eggs in the nest of another species, the host species, and then the host ends up caring for the young exclusively. But female cowbirds do put in a lot of work to choose what they think will be a good host nest for their young. So they do actually make decisions about where to parasitize. It's just that they don't do the care themselves. So going back to my research question then, knowing that the preen oil differs between song sparrows and cowbirds, I wanted to know if song sparrows could use that odor maybe to their advantage, or can they at least tell the difference or recognize cowbird odor? So using this two-choice maze, I gave song sparrows the option to spend time with that cowbird odor of females or with no odor at all. And I predicted that they would maybe spend more time with the cowbird odor because it should be relevant to them. So I thought they might feel maybe aggressively towards the cowbird odor because males are quite territorial and defensive during the breeding season. So I predicted that they would maybe spend time with that odor. And so I gave the birds 10 minutes to, well, I gave them 5 minutes to explore the maze, first of all, and then I recorded where they spent their time over 10 minutes. How much time did they spend in the right side of the maze with the cowbird odor, for example? How much time did they spend in the left side of the maze with no odor? And so I'll show you the results of this experiment, but first I'll just let you know that the vertical axis is the amount of time the birds spent with the cowbird odor or the no odor trial. And then on the x-axis, I've split up the responses by male song sparrows. I had 23 who completed this experiment. And then I had female song sparrows, only 7. They're harder to catch than males, so I didn't have as many. And so you can see the responses for each sex. And what I thought was really interesting is that I found a sex-specific response. So male song sparrows did what I predicted. They spent significantly more time with cowbird odor than with no odor, but females did the opposite, and they actually seemed to avoid the cowbird odor, and they spent more time in the side of the maze that had the solvent only or the no odor treatment. And I thought this could be because males might be responding aggressively to the cowbird odor. In the wild, they might smell a cowbird and try to exclude her from the territory. And perhaps females would respond aversively. So I performed these experiments on breeding conditioned birds. And so the females might have been motivated to, try to build a nest and lay eggs, and if they smell a cowbird, that might indicate to them that this is not a good environment to raise a family. But I haven't tested that. That's just how I explain these results. So the next thing I wanted to do is within the song sparrows themselves, I wanted to see whether the sexes are different in terms of their preen oil composition. So I did the same kind of thing with chemically analyzing the preen oil from breeding males and breeding females. And there's more overlap within the species, but here in purple, you can see the male's preen oil composition, and in yellow, you can see the female's composition. And again, the sexes are significantly different in terms of their preen oil chemical makeup. But interestingly, this difference is only observable when they're in breeding condition, and it completely disappears when the birds are not breeding. So again, I used the Y-maze design to test whether song sparrows can differentiate between the preen oil odor of males and females. Again, these were breeding conditioned birds. And so for a male song sparrow, I would give him preen oil odor from a female and from a male. And I predicted that he should probably spend more time with the female odor than the male odor. indicating a preference for that odor, because they should be motivated to try to mate and raise a family. I also, again, tested females, and here I had the opposite prediction. So I predicted females would spend more time with male odor, preferring that odor because they're motivated to breed. So the results are set up in the exact same way as before, with the time the birds spent with each sample on the vertical axis. The male responses, this time I had 26, and the female responses, this time I had 8. And I did have support for this prediction. So males, you can really tell, spent almost twice as much time with female odor compared to the time they spent with male odor, and that was a significant difference. Because I have fewer females, it's a little harder to tell, but the trend and the statistical results were the same. The females spent significantly more time with male odor than with female odor. So both males and females seem to prefer opposite sex odor when they're in breeding condition. Now I'm going to switch focus a little bit and think about some of the other kinds of information that might be important when choosing a mate. So of course you have to find the right species, you have to find the right sex if your goal is to lay eggs, rear chicks, and fledge a brood of young, which is typically the goal of most birds, I think. Can't really ask them, but that's as best as we know. But once you've identified the right sex to mate with, you also want to typically choose a mate that is a good one. And this can take a variety of forms. You might want a mate that's healthy, that's attractive, with sexy plumage and a beautiful song that indicates he's fit and healthy. But you also want individuals that are genetically compatible. So we know typically that inbreeding, for example, tends to be harmful. And so I focused on this interesting gene region called the MHC. And this is involved in immune defense. So humans, mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, we all have this MHC gene region, and it does help protect us from disease. So I'll give a little bit of an intro on how this works before I talk about the next study. So this MHC gene region produces MHC proteins, and what's interesting about this gene region is that it's really diverse, and we can produce multiple different proteins, not just 1 or 2, but anywhere from 10 to 20 or more. And individuals really vary in how diverse they are at MHC and how many proteins they can make. So each of these MHC proteins is able to recognize a specific pathogen, and when it does that, it will then work to eliminate and destroy that pathogen, thereby protecting us from disease. So the more different kinds of proteins we have, typically the more different kinds of pathogens we can recognize, defend against, and eliminate. Unfortunately, MHC does not work against coronavirus, but it does work against things like bacterial infections and other kinds of disease-causing pathogens. So the more proteins, as I mentioned, that we have, the more healthy we might be. But also, if we choose a mate whose MHC proteins are different from ours, we're then more likely to produce offspring that have a unique set of diverse proteins. And that should help then the offspring be more healthy and better able to defend against diseases. So it's useful to have a diverse and healthy mate, both because the mate will be healthy, but also because it can help the offspring be healthy as well. As I mentioned, mammals, including humans, also have this MHC gene region. And we know from some interesting studies done in the 90s that humans can smell somehow the MHC genotype of potential mates. So this was a study done with undergraduate students where men were asked to wear the same shirt for several days, and then women were asked to smell these stinky t-shirts and rate how attractive or unattractive they found the body odor of these men. And it turned out that women tended to rate the body odor as more attractive when the odor came from men whose MHC genotype was different from the women's genotype. So if a man had a similar genotype, the women tended not to like that odor very much or find it unattractive, unappealing. And so I basically wanted to know if song sparrows, if birds can do this too. So in this case, I want to give you just a little background on why I thought this might work. And these data are just plotted a little differently than those yellow and purple plots. This is showing a correlation between the chemical composition of the preen oil and the genotype at this MHC region. So it's a bit of a messy plot, but on the vertical you can see the chemical composition. It's converted into a distance, so we can compare it with the MHC genotype, which is also a distance. And basically what we found was that birds whose preen oil, that chromatogram I showed before, when the composition was more similar, they also tended to have a more similar MHC genotype. And when their preen oil composition was more different, their MHC genotype tended to be more different. So in this case, each of these points is a comparison between two individuals. But overall, it looks like preen oil could also perhaps give some information like the BO of humans about this MHC genotype. So for this last study that I'll share with you, I brought birds into the lab, as I mentioned before, and then I genotyped them at MHC, and then I created these pairs. So for a male, I would find which female I had captured was more similar at MHC to that male, and which female was less similar at MHC to that male. And then I would do that for every male. And for females, I did the same, but I gave them male preen oil to choose from. And so in this case, I predicted, because having a dissimilar mate should probably make your offspring healthier, because their MHC genotype would be more diverse if they're getting different proteins from mom and dad. I predicted that song sparrows would spend more time and prefer the odor of an MHC dissimilar potential mate. So they'd spend less time with a similar odor. And this similarity, again, was based on creating these distance measures of how many proteins the individuals share. But I also looked at the diversity overall, which would be how many different proteins the individuals had. So I might have 5 proteins and another female might have 10 proteins, in which case I would be less diverse than the other female, and so on. And so when I looked at the data this way, I predicted that the birds would spend more time with the preen oil odor from a more diverse individual with more MHC proteins, because they should probably be healthier and therefore more attractive as the mate. And so the data are set up in the same way. The amount of time spent with the preen oil is on the vertical axis. But this time the left panel shows that similarity measurement and the right panel shows that diversity measurement. But either way, I looked at these experimental results, and these are for both male and female song sparrows. I found that they spent significantly more time with preen oil odor of genetically dissimilar potential mate. So males spent more time with MHC dissimilar females, and females spent more time with MHC dissimilar males odor. And if I looked at the diversity, just the number of proteins, the result was the same. So both males and females spent more time with preen oil odor from potential mates who were more diverse at MHC compared to the time they spent with potential mates who were less diverse at MHC. So I know that was a whole bunch of data that I threw at you, but I'm just going to summarize all of that here, and then we can get to questions shortly. So first, I found that the chemical makeup of preen oil is significantly different between species, for example, between the female cowbirds and between song sparrows. And in song sparrows that are breeding, the preen oil significantly differs between the sexes. So males and females are different chemically, and they probably then smell different. I found that the chemical makeup of preen oil is correlated with genotype at this MHC immune gene region. So birds that have more similar preen oil have a more similar MHC genotype, and birds that are less similar in their preen oil are less similar in their MHC genotype. And looking at those choice experiments, I found that song sparrows do seem to use preen oil to assess species. In this case, males spent more time with cowbird odor and females seemed to avoid it. Birds can use preen oil to assess sex of their own species. So in this case, both males and females spent more time with the opposite sex odor. And they do also seem to use this preen oil odor to assess genotype. And here again, both sexes preferred dissimilar and diverse potential mates at this important immune gene region. So I hope I've convinced you that there is a lot of information available in preen oil that birds might be using out in the environment, sort of under our noses, if I can throw a pun in right at the end. And this odor can be used, among other things that I've not talked about today, this odor can be used to assess species, potentially helping birds evade parasites and predators or find the right species to mate with, for example, in terms of cryptic species. They can use this odor to assess sex, making sure they can find the right sex to mate with. And they can also assess genotype and potentially choose a healthy or compatible mate and have better breeding success through that choice. And so one of the things that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we think a lot about birds singing and birds using their plumage to signal their quality. But I'm really interested in getting to the bottom of how important are these odor cues to the birds. So I sort of imagine a scenario where the males, you know, as many have already done, have returned to the breeding territory a little bit ahead of the females. They've established their territory. The females show up and they start moving around the environment, listening to some male songs. And if they hear an attractive song, they might come into the territory and they might visually check that male out. You know, is his plumage bright? Does he look healthy? And if he does, she might come in a little closer and get a whiff. And, you know, does that male smell attractive? Does he smell healthy? Does he smell, you know, sexy? And if he doesn't, if his song's good, if his plumage is good, but he doesn't smell good, is that a deal breaker? Or would the birds go for it anyway? If a female comes in and the male thinks she smells bad, is that a deal breaker? These are some of the questions we don't really have answers to yet. So that's the kind of stuff I'm really interested in exploring in the future. And with that, I'd like to, again, just thank you so much for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Holy smokes, that's incredible. Some questions are here already, but I just wanted to, first of all, say thank you for taking the time to break that down for us, Leanne. What interesting work. I think before I get to these questions, I think I would just want to ask, what triggered you? What happened in your studying that made you want to research this further?
Oh yeah, thanks. As you mentioned, I did my master's research with the one and only Jim Quinn, and I got to go work with smooth-billed awnies in Puerto Rico. And I wish I had a photo of them to pop up really quick, but I encourage everyone to look them up if you don't know them. They're really cool birds, and they're also really stinky. Like you can find a nest by smelling it, or at least I can. And that was actually the first time I ever thought about smell in birds, and I had no idea that anyone studied it. I tried to get some preen oil, but I felt nervous and I didn't do a very good job. I don't even know why I thought the preen oil might be the thing to look at. And then I studied their acoustic communication and sort of forgot about it for a while until I interviewed in Beth McDougall-Shackleton's lab, and a Ph.D. student there was looking for correlations between the preen oil and this genotype stuff. And I sort of just went, holy cow, I was thinking about this a few years ago and I didn't know people studied it. And so it was kind of just one of those fortuitous events. And he was not going to finish some of the follow-up research, which is some of what I presented. And so I just went for it and grabbed all this preen oil, and I haven't looked back.
Wow. That's pretty cool. And I mean, during your talk, I was just kind of Googling birds' senses of smell. Can birds smell? And it's funny seeing like birds don't really rely on their smell that much. You know, you see that here and there. And there are some papers it looks like, but it looks like this is kind of some cutting edge information, which is hot off the press, right? Like you only just released this recently, and I linked the conversation article in the chat for people
Oh,
to
thanks.
see. Has anyone else been picking this up from you, or is this generating some more aha moments in others lately?
Yeah, so I definitely can't take credit for the field. There were some researchers in the 60s and 70s. Bernice Wenzel and Gabrielle Nevitt were some of the earlier researchers who started looking at whether or not birds can smell. And they looked a lot from the perspective of foraging and things like that. And then into the 90s, a lot of people looked at preen oil just to kind of see what it was made of and try to understand what sort of functions it might have beyond waterproofing. But it is a growing field. So there's probably about 15 avian chemical ecologists like myself who are really doing this research, but there's still a ton to learn. So I've been reviewing the literature recently, and there's less than 100 papers really on anything to do with preen oil and odor and stuff like that. So compared to the number of papers you could find on song, for example, or visual traits, it's pretty small but growing. And I didn't invent it, but I hope that I'm encouraging other people to sort of get on board and do this work.
I mean, I haven't heard any comments about birds and smell in the last 12 years in any circle I've been in. So you're right. That's great to of course give that credit where credit's due. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where else this goes. Now, I have a couple other questions, but I want to get to a few. So Sheldon McGregor says, does preen oil vary within an individual bird with season or dietary factors?
Yes. Yes, I didn't show the data, but there is seasonal variation. So as I mentioned, those sex differences are only detectable during the breeding season, and they disappear in the non-breeding season. The review paper I'm working on is about seasonal and sex differences, and so we know that preen oil varies probably throughout the year, definitely between the breeding and non-breeding season in pretty much all species that have been studied, which is only about 60 species, but it seems ubiquitous. There is also some work showing that preen oil varies with diet. I've done a little bit of work on that myself, and there's a few other studies. But interestingly, if you bring birds into captivity, feed them the same diet, they still show this variation in preen oil over time. So there's some kind of physiological change that we think is related to like breeding hormones, maybe other factors, as well as diet, as well as some other stuff. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks.
Cool. Hopefully that helps, Sheldon. And then this question kind of segues off of that. So Peter Tome says, when doing these comparative analyses, how do you allow for or acknowledge that these birds are under several stresses? For example, being in captivity in a wide trap and have been captured and removed from their breeding site.
Sure. Maybe I'll answer in case you were curious about the field sampling, just in terms of stressing the birds out while handling them to get some of those initial samples. We really only handle them for about 5 minutes tops. So we know from other research, things like cortisol or stress hormones take a little bit of time to build up. And so we don't tend to think the stress of handling bothers them enough to change any of the prenoil or other data collection on that end. The birds that I brought into captivity, it was a group of 40. I habituated them to being in captivity for a couple of months. I overwintered them before I began the experiments at all. So I gave them a lot of time to get used to the new conditions. And then we would put them in the maze. I had an image at the beginning. So the maze was, it's a plexiglass maze, but I covered the outside of the maze with brown paper so that it would be opaque, so that the birds wouldn't be looking at anything else in the environment when they were in the maze, to try to reduce stress or distractions that way. And then when I put the birds in the maze for the first time, there was a little start chamber that the birds sat in for 5 minutes. So I gave them that 5 minutes to know, okay, there's a new environment, you're here. And then that's another reason I gave them 5 minutes to explore the whole maze, so they could say, okay, I'm in this maze. And then I basically just hoped that in that final 10 minutes, they would kind of have enough time to calm down, know that they were in an environment that they couldn't really get out of. There was a mesh on top of the cage so they could detect the ceiling, so they wouldn't spend the whole time just trying to escape or hurt themselves. So they probably were under some stress because they don't like it when you take them out of their cage, put them in a bag, take them up into a room and put them in a maze. But we sort of did all the things we could to minimize the stress. And these experiments happened also every day at the same time. And, you know, I do things like knock on the door before I enter so that the birds start to get used to the routine. And I actually did, I showed you these 3 experiments. I did another 2 as well. So the birds kind of all got a chance to be in the maze over several weeks. Sparrows don't like anything, but I did my best. I think the fact that they responded at all shows that they were kind of okay with it enough, because they could have also stayed in the center of the maze or at the base of the maze. They didn't have to move at all. And so they could have just hunkered down if they were really stressed. So that's why my sample sizes are a little different between trials too, because sometimes a bird didn't meet the criteria for me to count the trial. And that could have been a bird that was a bit stressed or just wasn't having it. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It was probably a long answer, sorry.
No, you know, and, you know, I think, yeah, that was just one question, you know, thinking about who Peter is and just, yeah, about how you would account for taking an animal from the wild and then working through that. So that's great. Sounds like you thought that through real well. Rose Peterson wants you to know super talk, really something I've never thought about. So that's cool. Thanks to Rose. David Brewer. So did you try to identify the individual chromatographic peaks as specific organic compounds by mass? So this is in the Q&A. I don't even know this word. Spectroscopy and or nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So this says this might give you the chemical signature of a cowbird smell or a male/female song sparrow smell. It would also allow you to do experiments with synthetic samples. So yeah, can you answer that?
Yes, I can, thanks. Yeah, so I used gas chromatography with mass spectrometry on some of my samples so that I could identify what all the compounds were in those chromatogram peaks that I showed. If you're really interested, you could always shoot me an email. I could give you all the nerdy details. But for brevity, I'll just say they are mostly wax esters. So that's a special chemical compound. It's a fatty acid linked by an ester bond to a fatty alcohol. And these were hydrocarbon chains of about 30 carbons to about 38 carbons. And I did find some proportional differences in some of these esters between males and females and other groups that I looked at, like adults and young, and between seasons and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I didn't do anything trying to make synthetics because these esters are probably breaking down and creating volatiles that the birds smell later on in the process. And I didn't do the MS on the cowbirds, the mass spec, just because it's quite expensive. So yeah, so, but I do have some of that information. I'll pop my email in the chat if you want more details. I'd be happy to share them. And thanks. And I didn't do the NMRI stuff.
Cool. So David Brewer. So there you go. There's her email address.
Otherwise, I'll forget.
Yeah, no, good call. I don't know what any of that means. So, so the macaws are wondering, are there birds whose preen oil is much more waterproof than others? Col de canard is now used to tie floating fishing flies. So are there birds whose preen oil is more waterproof than others?
So I personally haven't like tested or studied that, but I mean, we know, animals like penguins are spending tons of time in the water and they need to not have their feathers getting waterlogged and cooling them down, dragging them down. So there are, I think, some of these chemical differences will be related to differences in things like how good the preen oil is at waterproofing the feathers. That's not something I've specifically looked at, but I certainly think it's likely, yeah.
Are there pheromones in preen oil from Mike Rowlands?
Yeah, so in the chemical ecology world, pheromone has, a special definition, and it's going to relate to the specific chemicals that the animals are responding to that definitely has the signaling function to say, hey, I'm a male, or hey, I'm an attractive male, and stuff like that. And so with the work that I've done so far on preen oil, I know what the chemicals are big picture, but I don't know which subsets of chemicals the birds are responding to. I just know that they're responding. So in that chromatogram, there was about 40 peaks, and each of those peaks is actually made up usually of about 2 to 5 different compounds. So there's hundreds of things in the preen oil, and to find out for every species which chemical or set of chemicals that they're specifically responding to is difficult, and it would be different for every species. So that's the reason we don't say pheromones yet. But there are some species that are well studied where people have found some smaller molecules that differ, that we're getting closer to maybe being able to use that word specifically. But that's kind of why I avoid it at this point, because for song sparrows, I don't know exactly which chemical they are listening to in any given context.
Cool. Okay. I think there's only a couple questions left. Peter Langbaugh wants to know, why are male sparrows easier to trap than females? Since I am a human male, please answer using small words.
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. The females, well, I showed the 2 kinds of traps. So there's the potter traps. Those are those ones that are on the ground that you bait with seed. And you get close to 50-50 sex ratio in those because all the birds in early spring are hungry and they want food. And they actually tend to go in the trap more than once. So the experience of getting caught and captured and sampled does not deter them from going in the trap day after day, which I think is another point in favor of them not being super stressed, just to go back to a prior question. But for the captive studies, I wanted to catch the birds in fall because I needed to overwinter them and then bring them into breeding condition, do the experiments, and then let them go in time for them to have a successful life and breeding season. So I did those experiments early in the season by changing light levels and various things. But in the fall, the birds have finished breeding, the young have fledged, they're not really on their territories anymore, And the males are the ones that are typically more territorial. And so I couldn't really get them to go in ground traps anymore because there's also tons of food everywhere. So to bring the birds in captivity, I use mist nets, and we do targeted mist netting using playback. And so usually I would play male song to try to get the little bit of territoriality left out of the adult males. And then I would play juvenile distress calls to try to get the females in. But they are just less responsive, and they're a little more cautious to go in the mist net. So so that's basically, they don't respond as well to playback as the males do. And it's interesting because the juveniles are kind of dopey. They'll hear something and they'll just go charging right in, like nobody's business, and you can catch like a whole family of juveniles. But I only worked with adults, so I had to throw the young ones back.
The thought that you've put into the study is incredible. I mean, I was worried to ask a little bit about what happened to the birds at the end when you were done with the study. I mean, I assumed you probably let some go, but I didn't want to, in case you couldn't, because you're not supposed to release animals once they've been captive for a little bit, but that's only if that's true for turtles, not so much for birds necessarily. So anyways, but it's so great to hear that you've thought about the time frame of everything and being able to let them continue to fulfill their lives. So
yeah, I don't like to do anything lethal. So I have occasionally collaborated with people that euthanize birds at the end of the experiment due to the nature of their research. But in this case, because they were just sort of taking a break from migration and living in the lab and eating good and then just hanging out in a maze, there was no real risk to just letting them go again the next spring. So that was great. Yeah.
cool. So what can we look out for this migration season when we're out in the field? Like, are we looking for birds preening? Like, I see birds noodling around their wings, so that gland is at the base of their tail, so they've got to like get under there to get to the preen oil, and then they're wiping it all over themselves. Like, I see birds wiping their beaks on branches. I see chickadees and things. So are they just dousing themselves? Are they putting it in certain spots? Are they wiping it on branches and on other things, do you think? Like, what kind of things can we be looking for to notice this behavior in the wild?
Thanks for that question. With respect to that bill wiping behavior, that's actually sort of spoiler, one of the things I want to study next. So I have a hypothesis that birds might wipe preen oil on spots of their territory, kind of the way that dogs and cats and other mammals might scent mark. And so that's something I'm hoping to test. Other people have speculated that may be the case, but we really don't know yet. But birds do bill wipe quite a lot. It's often thought to be a displacement behavior that doesn't really mean anything, or sometimes, of course, they do it to get food or gunk off their bill. But you do sometimes see birds preen or sort of access the gland and then wipe. And so far, we don't know what that means or if it means anything. And yeah, I think another reason probably that people have thought birds don't smell is it's kind of hard to tell, like, what would a bird smelling look like? I did all these experiments and I've worked a lot with birds, and I don't usually see them do anything obvious, like sometimes, because their nostrils are firm on their bill, so we can't see their nose wrinkling or moving or flaring or any of those other signs we might look at in a mammal or something. But I have sometimes seen birds like put their head up a little bit and kind of move around, and sometimes I wonder, is that a bird smelling? I don't know, but it might be something to look for. The other thing I think would be really neat to try to observe more, like I mentioned, when birds are getting ready to breed, or they're choosing or traveling on territories and sussing each other out, are they doing anything that looks like they might be investigating each other by smell? So are they getting close and putting their beaks in each other's feathers or near each other's preen gland, or what? It's kind of tricky to see that sort of behavior in the wild, but it would be interesting to start to document stuff like that.
Yeah, I wondered if there were, yeah, if there were some visual cues that we would see. I know once I watched a male hummingbird display for a female where a female sat still and the male did this in front of it, and it did that several times. It flew back and forth, and it just kept doing this, and then I think it would land and then it would do it again, and so maybe it was wafting smell at it, it was like, but anyways, yeah.
I actually have a friend, if you ever want to invite Rick Simpson, he actually studies coloration in hummingbirds, and something that he's found is that the males, when they do that kind of display, what they're doing is actually taking advantage of the sun's angle to make sure the females see like the maximum iridescence, so they look like the brightest and the sexiest. So that's kind of point for him, point against me. But when you asked about whether the birds groom or preen certain areas more than others, we do know I think it's greater flamingos. I'd have to double check the species, but there's 2 papers about greater flamingos, and it looks like they actually have carotenoids in their preen oil. So the food bait, like the dietary pigment that gives that orange color to like cedar waxwings and other stuff. They have a lot of carotenoids in their preen oil from their crustacean diet, and in the breeding season, they'll actually significantly more often put the preen oil on parts of their shoulders, and they think it's like a makeup where the males are trying to make themselves like more orangey and more attractive. So there's a little bit of information on stuff like that, as even using preen oil like a visual cue, but we know so little about that. That's the only thing I'm aware of where we actually know they seem to preferentially, lubricate or advertise on some part of the body.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You bring up a good point about visual marking. I know when I've been in talks listening to Wild Ontario from the University of Guelph, and it's where I learned that American kestrels can visually see urine traces from rodents scent marking on the ground using ultraviolet light, and so like I didn't know that before talking to them or hearing that from them, and so yeah, I wonder if there's certain preen oil that is being wiped that we can't see, but other birds can see it smeared all over the place.
Yeah, in my next life, I want to run around with a handheld UV lamp and just spy on all the secret UV signals of birds, because I think a lot more species than we realize probably are communicating in that way, and it would be really neat to see if preen oil maybe enhances that UV reflectance or contributes. Yeah, there's so many cool things we don't know. It's very exciting to me.
And I wonder too about like, you see birds having dust baths, and an actual like in the water and splashing around. I wonder what order, it occurs in, or when they're then putting the preen oil on themselves in that time, if it enhances or takes away, or it cleanses them so they can start over again. But that's again for another study for another time.
Yeah.
Any other last messages you think? What last things could the people attending this talk right now, be taking away from this year and beyond when it comes to birds and smelling?
Ooh, that's a big question. I mean, first of all, I hope I've convinced everyone that birds can and do smell. Both they can stink, but also they can smell each other and use those smells in their social lives. But I think like one of the things that makes me most excited about this research is just that, birds are one of the most well-studied kinds of animals on the planet. Some of the earliest cave paintings that humans ever made are of birds. And so you know, we've obviously been extremely fascinated by birds for tens of thousands of years, and yet we still have so much to learn about them. Like you mentioned, we're just starting to explore, you know, how they see in the ultraviolet spectrum. We know that they can hear infrasound, which we can't do. They can sense electromagnetic fields. We know they have this sophisticated sense of smell and vision and sound. And so I actually think that they could be one of the most sophisticated kinds of animals in the world in terms of all the different kinds of information they can use. And so I just think, you know, so many people are taking up birding this year with, well, last year, this year with COVID. And there's always something new to kind of learn and fall in love with about birds. So I just think it's endless, and it makes me feel just excited to keep learning and keep getting out there and looking at stuff and getting new ideas. So also for anyone who does bird banding, I just recommend that you take a moment before you release your birds to just smell them and see what they smell like. That's what I do now in my research. After I collect my samples, I sniff all my birds. So if you can do them safely.
Any data there? Any birds have a particular scent over another that you've noticed anecdotally?
Well, grackles are gross, which will surprise no one. I guess it was a coincidence, but I smelled this American redstart last fall. I'm doing research at the Long Point Bird Observatory last fall, and also I'll be going shortly this spring. And I smelled this redstart that was like a pumpkin spice latte. It was like the most delicious kind of cinnamony, sweet, excellent smell. And I got really excited. And then only one other redstart smelled like that, and the rest just smelled kind of dusty. So I think they probably were in some kind of plant or shrub or garbage. I don't know. But that was like really exciting, but I don't think it was a natural odor. I think it was something that they had gotten into or been feeding on, but it was amazing. So yeah.
Interesting. I had to ask because, again, I have no sense of smell. So I've never smelled a thing in my life. So to think about picking up a bird and giving it a whiff, if there's differences between species, or if, like, I mean, I didn't think grackles would smell, but maybe now I will. Great. Well, this has been awesome. This has been enlightening. You've given me and a lot of people here something to think about, especially when it comes to watching bird behavior and watching to see what they do. So on behalf of the Bird Study Group and the Hamilton Naturalist Club, Leanne, thank you so much for your time today and tonight.
You're very welcome. Yeah, thanks again for having me. And again, if anyone has questions down the road, I'm always happy to answer an email or anything like that. So yeah, thanks again.
You mentioned you're on social media. I thought I saw that at the beginning. Are you on Twitter? Is there?
Yes, it's why I can pop that in the chat. It's Leagrie. It's just sort of half of my name.
Nice. Great.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to discovering whatever else you've discovered, and I wish you all the success throughout your career and throughout your hobby as a birder and an ornithologist. Thank you so much, Leanne.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, and to everyone else who's still here, we will see you next month for Rob Porter's talk, where we'll be not doing the smelling part, but the hearing part. So we'll see you perhaps in April, or we'll see you on the trail. Stay safe, stay well, and have a great rest of your night. Goodbye, everybody.